Sweet. Hello, everyone. Today is Tuesday, October 24th, 2023. This is a meeting of the SIG Network Policy API subgroup to SIG Network. This is a CNCF sponsored meeting, so please be nice to each other and follow their code of conduct. We'll go ahead and hop right into it today. Before we hop into the agenda, is there anything folks want to cover? I'm going to take that as a no. I'm not sharing my screen today, so I hope folks are giving a look to the agenda document, which I'll put the link to in the chat. Okay, first thing, Surya, you want to talk a little bit about egress destination some more as part of your egress NPAP.
Yes, I think we have talked a little bit about this before on several different occasions, but I am trying to gather more feedback before we nail in on what kind of API we want to implement for egress. So the NPEP was very much focused on egress use cases and user stories. So we explicitly said it's for egress outside the cluster. So let me rephrase that: northbound traffic scenarios, right? But then recently we've had this discussion come up oftentimes that what does it mean for a destination to be external to the cluster? Because this is not really well defined for a lot of implementations. Like for some implementations, internal and external is well known and clearly differentiable, but for some it's not, and for some it's a blurry line. So as far as network policy API goes, it just has an IP block, right? It's not egress, it's not ingress. You can put whatever you want on there. We have something called egress firewall on Red Hat OpenShift platform, which was meant to be egress only. So I guess the general question I have is, do we want to keep the original user stories in mind and then really say that this is an egress only field, in which case, how do we ensure validation in that aspect, right? Like from API perspective, it's not like we have webhooks or anything or admission controllers that are checking if it's in external or internal or whatever. So do we leave it up to the implementations, making it implementation defined? Are we going to be strict on our API, or we just put a comment on the field itself saying, hey, this is meant for external. We don't really expect you to put a pod side or a service side or a node side or a join side or whatever internal that is. It's not meant for that, but if you do it, you shoot yourself in the foot kind of thing. Or we just keep it like the priority field in ANP saying it's undefined. And when I say that, I mean, when you have multiple ANPs with same priority, we just call it out as unprecedented or undefined, right? So do we want that, right? So which of these behaviors is more acceptable? I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion. So opening the floor here.
Does it boil down to what we were talking about the other day? Like, is a good example of it kind of boiling down to if you use a CIDR block that includes pods, they'll be selected or not? Does it boil down to that feature in a lot of ways?
Yeah, I think it correlates to what we were speaking about the other day, right? Do we want this field to also allow pod CIDR blocks and service CIDR blocks kind of thing, right? Or are we explicitly defining it for egress? Because I do call it external network, right? So.
Nadia?
Yeah, I wanted to say that, first of all, I think we can still talk in the user stories about external networks, right? Because that's why we wanted this field initially, but then have like a different opinion, so to say, in the API design itself, and say that it makes sense to also allow selecting pods by IP. And there is I'm not sure what is exactly the problem with that, since I think it just saying that all IPs will be selected by that, including pod, service, and whatever, it makes define the behavior actually better between different implementations, because it's obvious how it's gonna work, than just leaving that part when it will not be applied to some endpoints because they are also pods or something else. And then to the another point which Rahul actually left here, that defining rules for external networks only can be useful sometimes. That is a good use case, but I'm not sure if saying that 000/0 is a good selector for all external traffic. I mean, potentially we could have probably some other aliases similar to what we discussed last time for like local node, saying like external traffic, and that this alias would be actually defined by the implementation itself, and then it will be probably very different based on the network plugin implementation. Yeah, that's what I think.
Dan?
So I was going to say, if we do say, no, it really means external only, then that allows implementers to implement it in different ways than if we say it has to apply to all pod or all IPs. In the same way that like in Innovian and Kubernetes, egress firewall is done differently than network policy. You could potentially apply the cluster egress ANPs somewhere different than, although actually, wait, no, you can't do that because they have to interact with regular network policy IP block rules. That's going to be a mess. Okay, so actually the fact that we have to think about how this interacts with network policy IP block rules, because that may constrain our options. Or we may want to say that it interacts in weird ways.
It would be weird to kind of change the behavior from network policy and then have those interactions, right? Like we're saying, if we said it's only egress, but then in network policy, it's egress or pod, things get weird because then you're saying network policy, are you going to have fall through problems there, right? So say you allow all egress except the pod subnet. In net, well, I guess that wouldn't matter.
So all zeros will just mean different things in ANP and network policy, which definitely is going to be confusing. And then
yeah, it's a good
again, like trying to only apply that to the external network also will make the API, as we've outlined, less defined, so to say, because like what each plugin considers to be an external network will kind of change the behavior.
Bro.
I mean,
well, sorry. Go ahead, Raul.
Yeah. The only question I had was, I think Suri already mentions this either in the KEP or somewhere else, but I'm pretty sure network policy is pretty undefined on that, right? Like, I know for a fact that Calico and Cilium, for instance, behave differently with the IP block selector, and I think that's okay spec-wise. So is there even something we can curve to?
So Cilium does behave differently than most other implementations, and it fails the E2E tests in Kubernetes. So I would say that means that Cilium's implementation is incorrect, and the other plugins where IP blocks can match pod IPs are effectively correct, even though we didn't necessarily intend that behavior.
Okay.
Does that mean then that we never officially defined what an IP block means in network policy, or that we defined that it definitely does include pod side or anything you put in it? Like, is it clearly defined, or is it more of a we just got it for free thing?
I think the documentation probably talks about external IPs. I don't know what the documentation currently says. The use case was for external IPs. It's hard to test rules against external IPs in the E2E tests because you don't have specific external IPs that you can necessarily assume that the E2E test is going to have access to anyway. So people are just like, oh, I'll just write E2E tests using pod IPs, and sort of then accidentally made that part of the API basically.
It does say in our documentation, like Raul just posted, these should be cluster external IPs since pod IPs are ephemeral and unpredictable. But it doesn't say.
Well, that's more of a rationale than an API description, and that is true. Like in general, you don't know specific pod IPs, right? So you're not going to have this long-standing rule saying you can't connect to 10.0.1.3 because that pod could exit and be recreated with a new IP. So that's the argument for not doing it. But
Yeah, I think I have another example to the point that different types of peers are basically just different ways to select endpoints. And basically, if pods have IPs, why can't they be selected? And then if we discuss FQDN-based selectors, right? There is a chance that some pod will be an endpoint that DNS server returns when you try to resolve a DNS name. We also probably don't want to say, oh, that's not allowed because FQDNs should only be for external endpoints, right? So what I'm saying is we probably will have different ways to select the same network endpoint, right? And then for pods, that can be pod selector, CIDR, or like FQDN rule. But then for external endpoints, well, they just don't have a pod selector, so you can do that. But then I don't see why you would want to limit that otherwise.
I would say that we absolutely want to say that FQDN rules cannot match pod IPs because
how can we check that?
Well, I mean, we don't necessarily have to enforce it, but we should certainly say that they're not expected and it's acceptable for an implementation to implement it in such a way that it won't work. Because like you don't need FQDN rules for pod IPs, right? You should just use label selectors. It's going to be much simpler. It will work better. It will be more efficient. Like you'd be crazy to use an FQDN rule for that. And so we should encourage people not to.
Well, actually, before we have service selectors, I mean, if I have a set of pods that are just backends to a service and I actually care about service, not the pod specifically, is there any other way for me to select them? I could just use like service DNS name for that.
Well, I wanted to call that out specifically because that's actually the worst use case, because for DNS will give you a VIP, right? And then now you're deep in the weeds where now you're requiring implementers to grab, the VIP from a return DNS, recognize that belongs to a service, unwrap that into all the pod IPs. Like now you're in some really complicated use cases when really we should just give people a service selector. If that's what they need, there's like a much more convenient way to do that, I think, more clearly.
Well, but what if it's a headless one though? I don't know if it's the right term. I think it's the one where you point to a service where you don't have selectors, right? Like it points to something else, maybe even external.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm being very rigid and opinionated, but if it's a Kubernetes object, we should use Kubernetes selectors, right? Like I want to select it by names and labels, not by the fact that the DNS spec says you can do some like slightly funky behavior. Maybe that's too rigid, but I think the better UX is ask them to go through label selectors that are provided by ANP in a more user-friendly manner.
Nadia, I think you were next.
Yeah, just to sum this up, well, we definitely want to encourage like the best options to select in cluster objects. Does that mean that we want to like explicitly disallow that, right? For all the other features, I mean, like selecting pods with CIDRs, especially. I mean, for FQDNs, I see why it may be tricky, but again, I think it kind of can work pretty much. But especially for pods and IPs, like, and especially for 0.0.0 case, right? I think like not selecting pods in that case may be tricky, even though if you do want to select pods by IPs, for some reason, we definitely should have some docs about that, saying like that it's not the best way to do that.
I mean, can we think about the functionality? Like if a user wants to only refer to external endpoints in an AMP with a 0000 rule, but we instead say that 0000 means everything, then you would just add an AMP rule above that rule saying allow to all pods, right? Pod selector or namespace selector all. So it's still like regardless of our decision, you could do what Rahul was kind of posting in the document, right?
Yeah, I mean, in that case, it would be a deny, but yeah, like your point is, I guess the use case the customer wanted was only external, not pods. But yeah, you could deny to pods explicitly and then 000.
Oh, yeah. I had it flipped.
But yeah, that would work.
Do they only want to deny node IPs and like everything that is kinda internal to the cluster but not pod IP?
I don't know what they wanted with node IPs. It's a very good question.
They might not have known.
Yeah, it is a funky use case, to be clear. Like I don't know that that's normal per se.
Yeah, sorry, I walked over the top of Surya, so go ahead, Surya.
Oh, no worries. So I think I'm hearing different aspects of how we want to use it, right? So does that mean that we should not be rigid? Like one thing that stuck to me is what Dan was mentioning in the beginning. So if we strictly say that the API is meant for external use only, implementations can, I don't know, choose to do what they want in different ways. But if we are saying that you can put anything there, so it should include or can include pod IPs, then all implementations have to implement that. Is that the way we want to go? Right? The interaction with the IP block aspect of it is different, right? Like it's a pass catch kind of thing, right? If it matches, we match, but if it doesn't, it doesn't.
I feel like we need some user stories involving or use cases involving external matches and IP block rules so that we can look at them and say, you know, what would we expect to happen in this case? Or is this actually reasonable? Do we believe that something good has to happen in this case? Or are we willing to say, no, that's dumb. We don't care if the result is confusing. Because I don't have a good sense right now of what might happen. And with BANPs as well.
Yeah. I agree with Dan. I think I don't have a good sense, but I also am hesitant to write a rule that says, you know, deny 00000 and that not mean block that pod off completely. Like from just from like a logical, like I'm a user, right? I don't know.
I think that depends on the wording though. Like if it's, you know, cluster egress match 000 deny, like that kind of makes it clear that it's not talking about pod IPs, right?
But what we struggle with before is defining the difference between like, and we know implementations are going to do this differently, defining the difference between internal traffic and external traffic, because it's not always a hard line.
It's even worse if it's in the cloud scenario, right? Because I know at least Ensure can be chained with something like the EKS CNI, so that, you know, we enforce the policies and the EKS CNI just manages, you know, the primary IPAM and stuff. So usually it's actually a hustle actually just for us to know what the positor is actually in the cluster, right? So that part of information isn't necessarily maintained by CNIs per se. So
Nadia?
Yeah, another little point to what Andrew said, right, about feeling kind of awkward with 000 not matching something, right? I know pod IP is like, I don't know, that 001, mathematically speaking, it matches 000/0. And I mean, it has IP. I would probably also be very surprised if like that didn't work.
Yeah. If I had to make the decision today, I would go with how it works in network policy. 0.000 would do everything. I kind of agree that that hasn't been done eloquently in network policy though, which is why we're thinking about it so hard. So that's kind of where I'm at on it. I think at the end of the day, like Surya's kind of, you're kind of, I'm not putting all the decision on you, but you're kind of compiling this. I think if there are some more use cases we can think about that argue the point of like making 0.000 apply to everything, those would be really relevant in the next like week or two to think about.
Yeah, the current NPEP didn't focus on those use cases, right? So if there is, then we can definitely do that. Or, I mean, doing the same thing that network policy is doing today, which is the 0.000 matching everything. Is that something we can try for alpha? And then if people don't like it, we can redo it before beta. Like, I just want to start somewhere. Or is this something that we're gonna hash out for a few more months?
I mean, I'd be all right with it. I think Dan has slightly different ideas of like stability of a resource. So I don't know. What do you think, Dan?
I'm not sure what you're saying. I mean, it's alpha. We can change it if we don't like it.
Cool. I was walking over some people there. So was it Raul? Did you have your hand up or did you take it down?
No, never mind.
Okay. Yang?
Nothing too much there. I think I just want to say I agree with what you say. And but the thing that sort of like bothers me is that, you know, if somebody in the field actually use it, we say it's 0.000 matches everything, something like that. And if somebody doesn't like it, it's not gonna be they don't like it. It's gonna be they're confused about it. Now we tell them, you know, it matches everything, and then we change it, they'll be, you know, even more confused, right? So to me, I think I wanted to go with, you know, what you were saying, because I feel like implementation wise, it's going to be really, really hard to enforce something like external only, right? Like for all the CNIs, if we wanted to enforce that on every possible platform, not only like just vanilla Kubernetes, but for all the cloud distributions where this is not usually maintained by CNIs, in the past experiences, I found that really, you know, tricky to say the least, if not impossible. So yeah, I would at least vote for, you know, we call it out as an external resource, like external CIDR use case only, but we can sort of like stop people from just putting a pod CIDR there. So that's also my take on this.
So just so I understand that clearly, you mean we should still call it as a field meant for external CIDRs or destinations outside, especially the northbound use cases, but
well,
we're
yeah,
not going to stop.
I do think that I like everything we mentioned in the meeting makes sense, right? Like you usually should not put a CIDR blocked for match and pods, as well as, you know, for FQDN rule, you usually don't want to, you know, put a service FQDN that's generated by Kubernetes. I think that's something that it seems like to me that most people in this call agrees. But the point is only where, you know, we can't really stop people from stepping on their toes, and we just wanted to call it out. And I don't know, you know, just assume the logical behavior of the API will take place in that specific scenario. So if, let's say, if a CIDR matches a pod IP and it's a drop rule, then we do actually expect the packet to be dropped, right? Like even though it's not like a valid use case, but I think in most implementations, this translating upon IP and enforcing a rule using IP should definitely work, right? I don't see a problem with that. Whereas if you define something like I want the egress CIDR to only be external, it feels like even more blurry to me on what that would mean, right? Somebody could come in and say, okay, this isn't external to my cluster, but this is internal to my cluster, but somehow you as a CNI has viewed it as external. Like now people will actually get confused, in my opinion. But this is just my thinking.
You're going with implementation defined, right? If I got that right. Like more than strictly making the API.
Yeah,
definition,
yes.
You prefer an implementation defined way of doing it. Okay.
Right. I don't really want to say implementation defined because I think all the implementations are actually effectively going to do the same thing, right? Oh, but you call it out CDM as a an example to not implementing pod CIDRs, right? So yeah, I don't know. Then I guess implementation defined is the word to summarize my stance, I guess. Yeah.
Nadia?
So if I got that right, you think external word should be somewhere in the name, right? Or not?
Ideally, yes.
Because I mean, if we say that it actually in the end applies to everything, and you have external networks deny 000, and then it applies to pod IPs, then it's getting even more confusing. Because that's where people could think, oh, internal traffic would not be included because the field is called external network, right?
I see what you mean. So you're saying that if we do it this way, we might as well just call it something like networks and just in something like comments, we just say it's supposed to be used for external things.
Yeah, but also 000 is not really supposed to be used. I mean, you probably don't want to put like pod IPs there for the exact same reasons as network policy API says, right? Because these IPs are changing and stuff. But then otherwise, there is, I don't know if there is any restriction to set that it must be external.
So Nadia, if I got your opinion right, you want exactly same as IP block network policy, right?
Well, not necessarily exactly the same, but I think the word external or accent on that may actually make it more confusing if we want to apply that 000 to everything.
Gotcha. So you want something more generic like a CIDR, which can be a CIDR. Anything, doesn't matter if it's internal, external. Got it. Okay. Just noting it down, right? For consensus purposes, not for anything else.
Sure,
right. I think a use case I could think of is that in a cluster where you have a really wildly misbehaving pods that sends malicious traffic out to everybody, maybe even out of the cluster, maybe even internal to the cluster. You want to just lock it down like completely. If you have like a network rule that says 000/0 and say I wanted to just deny it, I think it would make sense for it to mean that lock it down completely, right? Like in addition to like otherwise you would do something like I wanted to apply a 000 rule, which is only external. Now, in addition to that, you will also have a AMP rule that selects everything in the cluster and says drop as well. You will need two rules to do that. That might be a little bit counterintuitive to me, at least. But
okay, I think we have a lot of good talk on this. I would like to move forward. We spent a good bit of time on it. I think for next steps, for now, maybe kind of implement it with the consensus and go from there. Does that sound reasonable, Surya?
Yeah, but what is the consensus? I heard everybody say different things.
Oh, goodness gracious. I think there's that balance in there. Like, we can make 0, 0, 0, 0 mean everything. We can also not necessarily call the selector like egress selector. And then we can additionally add documentation that says, although you can select everything, we recommend that you do not select pods with this block of IPs with a CIDR, right? There's some balance, fine balance of documentation, what we expect, which will be a conformance test, and naming that should make this easier to grasp, right?
Yeah, so did I hear that right? That we don't want to call it external on the name of the field? Is that what you said, Andrew, or the reverse of it?
Correct. If we're saying that denied 0, 0, 0, 0 / 0 means denied everything, including pods, we shouldn't call it external network selector. And
Yeah,
vice versa.
and considering how network policy has been around for 5 or 6 years, have we had users complain about this aspect, that why does network policy allow everything in the IP block? Has anyone come up with this thing before? Like, no, Dan, do you know?
Network policy is generally confusing and annoying enough that, like, you know, I don't know if people expect it to behave
Yeah.
in reasonable ways.
In my experience, I've actually seen people exploit this and actually try to use network policy CIDRs to match pods. And we were talking to them like, wait, you shouldn't do that. You could use labels and selectors because pod IPs are ephemeral. You shouldn't really do that. And they were like, okay, this works better for my specific use case because blah blah blah. And they're like, we are using it, and since you're supporting it, right? Like I'm just gonna do a CIDR rule, and it's easier for me. So this is what I have seen, and it's working with Centric. So it's really bad, but
Gotcha. So I think then I will just go in that direction, right, Andrew? Which is we will keep it generic. I don't know, call it CIDRs, not external, not internal, nothing. We will also say that this is recommended to be used for external destinations, and then leave it at that.
Yeah, one other thing, if we want more voices too, like you could start, or we could start a thread in SIG network mailing and say like, what is, like, this is a very explicit example that we could say like, what do y'all think makes more sense? But I'll leave that up to you. If we as a group feel like we need more voices, let's do that. If not, let's just go with what you're talking about.
We can also ask for like suggestions, impressions, whatever, at the 2 KubeCon talks.
Sure.
Ooh,
Yeah.
that's a great idea.
Yeah, I like that too. So that kind of follows up into a thing I have on the agenda in a little bit. So.
Gotcha. And just quickly to touch upon one other topic in the same NPEP, I know that there's other topics in the agenda. I think there was generally not much interest in doing a new object, is my understanding. At least Nadia and Rahul mentioned on the NPEP that they would rather just have it in the main API itself and not do a new object for matching. I'm okay either ways, like I had mentioned. Just want to make sure that nobody else has objections in that case, right? So we fold it back into the main API as just another type of egress peer. So it'll just be a string of CIDRs or whatever. And then if people want to do the same thing across different admin network policies and baseline admin network policies, they can just copy paste stuff.
I'm all right with that. If at some point, yeah, if at some point it becomes more complex or we need to add more fields, we can reevaluate that. I think for now it's all right because it's just not that many fields.
Yeah, agreed. So I'll change that PR to reflect all these things. Yeah. Thank you all. Don't want to take any more time.
No, thank you. This is awesome. This is complex. So I'm glad we're all talking about it. I'm glad everyone's here. Okay, Rahul had to drop, but Rahul is looking for more review on FQDN. I think he was able to get to updating it right before this meeting. Let me just double check that. Yeah, it looks like he pushed some updates 1 hour ago, so that's ready to be reviewed again. So not much to talk about there, I don't think, unless there's anyone who wants to bring stuff up.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that makes sense to discuss without Rahul, but
Yeah,
I think we had like one main point that we didn't come up to a conclusion about yet. But yeah, maybe we can. I don't know. I tried to discuss that in our channel in Slack, but there wasn't much activity. So, and I wanted to kind of speed this process up a bit.
yeah, let's keep poking it. So if you want to, let me look at the channel. If you want to just poke that thread back to life in the main channel, I'm happy to chime in.
Yeah, I can do that.
Sweet. Cool. Hunter, doing some really cool work on Cyclonus, which I'm extremely excited about. Do you want to give the group kind of a rundown on what you've done in this PR?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, at a high level, we have the Cyclonus tool that Matt and I think Surya and others helped merge into our PR. I mean, our repo. In the agenda, there's a doc explaining like all the functionality of Cyclonus. But at a high level, it can do conformance tests that are pretty easy to code up, and it can also show a nice table describing the network policy. So in another meeting, we thought it'd be nice to do both of those for ANP and BANP. So I can show, maybe I'll share screen.
Yep. Let me make you a co-host. Okay, you should be able to share now.
Okay. And I'll try not to take up too much time here.
All good.
So created a couple issues around this. We were thinking, I guess, to call this feature maybe like NetPol Assistant or something. And yeah, so this is the base issue if anyone's interested. The idea is repurposing it to explain the configuration and run conformance tests, like I was just saying. And yes, so the first step was to just make the data structures so we could model everything. So wrote a PR for this. And this is kind of the result where we can, feed in a BANP using like our alpha API or beta. And yeah, you can say like I have a BANP that denies all. And then I also have an ANP that allows a couple things. And you can get this connectivity matrix where it say only allows this pod B, or yeah, like this pod B to A, and then everything else is dropped. And then you can also do the same labels concept. So here the X namespace pods can talk to each other. So that's basically what this PR does, is just gets that data structures and the probing to be all right. Kind of implements the ANP and does some validation. And the kind of last final thought is we want to get this kind of thing. I think this would be the next step, getting a table that looks like something like this.
Sweet. That's awesome. That's really cool. Good work. So the one question I have on the PR you have up right now, you show like a BANP example. Is it going to be hard to do the same thing with, like, say you have the same example, so BANP deny after ANP. What if you had a BN deny after ANP pass? Like, is it going to be a ton of work to show how network policies can play in there as well?
Yeah, so I think I implemented like all the possible interactions like with NetPol and stuff. Maybe I'll just pull up the code real quick.
Cool. And yeah, if I'm asking something naive because I haven't finished reviewing it, you can just tell me to go review it. That's all right too.
Oh, no worries. I mean, this is pretty large, so I do want to like give some pointers to help out, I guess.
Cool.
It's helpful, but yeah, like in the integration test, like I have just basic NetPol v1 connectivity, make sure we don't break that, then basic ANP, and then there's like BANP, and later on there's kind of all those interactions, ANP with NetPol v1, and then I think there's like a pass rule in here and some of that stuff. Yeah.
Okay. I'll take a look at that with that in mind. And this is just getting the data structure set up, and so that you can actually like print these tables. It's not actually, we haven't implemented any true connection testing yet, right? That's a whole nother step, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, so the next step is just kind of like, yeah, creating these network policies in a programmatic way.
Yep.
And then adding a test tag to that.
Cool. Sweet.
Yeah, so yeah, and I think I put a little comments to help with like how to read through this in the description. Like the connectivity package is just for like printing out things in the integration test. And then this matcher package is where all the data structures are relevant.
Cool.
But then there was this other idea I had too, that kind of just forming maybe at some point it would be simple to give someone like the ANP v1 NetPol and BANP, and you could tell them like for a given set of pods, like what's the flow of all the policies. Like you could say ANP passed on it and then BNP didn't do anything or something.
That'd be cool. Yeah, because we actually were just talking through scenarios like this for one of our KubeCon presentations, and it was very confusing. So if there's tooling that can help with that, that'd be really cool. Okay, cool. So I'm planning on giving this a review. I'm sorry with all these talks, I have been hung up, but this is really, really cool.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, just let me know. I think it'd be super cool if we could like show it to people if it looks helpful in the KubeCon talk. So let me know if there's anything I can help to kind of get it ready soon enough for y'all.
100%. I think this work definitely warrants highlighting in our maintainers track talk. So that's honest. I'm going to slide right into that as the next kind of topic of agenda. We have been working on a maintainers track talk. So I think that's me, Yang, Surya, and Dan are going to be doing that one. And we have some empty slides right now for enhancement proposals. And I think this isn't an enhancement proposal, but it's kind of like one of the cool work items. So I was going to be poking over the next week, Surya, Nadia, Rahul, and obviously Hunter, if we can get some of this stuff in, to give just a one slide summary of your NPEPs or kind of the work you're doing. And then additionally, I'll need headshots from you if I don't already have them, so we can give you credit for the work that's going on there. So I think this week, Hunter, I'll work to get your stuff reviewed. Do you think with that first PR that you'll have something? I mean, you don't even have to have it merged. Like if we want to just talk about kind of like the work you're doing, what your end goal is with some of this tooling, that also would be cool. I think people are going to be interested. So.
Okay, yeah, if we don't need to have it merged, I could also just like add a small layer to get the UI for like a demo or something. That helps.
Yeah, I don't even think we'll have time for a demo. Like if you can make something cool in a screenshot, like
yeah.
That'd be really cool. The main thing we want to use this talk for, Hunter, is like hopefully finding people who are interested in working with us. So like we'll say, oh, Hunter is like kind of pioneering this work on the Cyclonus tooling. This is where it's at. This is where we need help with.
Right.
And then hopefully after KubeCon, we get some people coming and getting on board to help you do that, right? That's kind of the Maintainers Track talk. So
okay, awesome, yeah.
Cool. What I'm going to do for those little short descriptions is I'm going to share the people I called out, so Surya, Nadia, Raul, and Hunter, and tag you on slides in our presentation to kind of populate with, if that's all right with you. Cool beans. I'm really excited about all of this. Are there any questions with all of that?
Do we want to mention Ingress and PEP or not yet? I'm fine if not, by the way, just
I mean this talk, like truly, like I'm not gatekeeping this talk at all. Like I don't want to. This is the Maintainers Track talk, so it's from all of us. It's not like highlighting like one of our efforts, right? It's like what the group as a whole is really interested in, what we're working on. So Nadia, if you want to make a slide for Ingress, that's great. I think we aren't going to have a lot of time to do, because we have a lot of stuff to talk about. Obviously, we aren't going to have a lot of time for each individual ones, but I'm happy to have it on there.
Yeah, sure. Just like if we want to add it to the list as like following up after egress, but somewhat slower. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I'm adding a slide for it right now, and I'll tag. I will share this slide deck with you four and tag your names on the right slides. Is everyone all right with that? We have a lot to talk about. That's a good thing. I'm really excited. This time last year, we probably wouldn't have had enough to talk about. So we've made progress. Last year, it was just Surya and I talking at a contributors summit talk, just trying to get everything accepted. Okay. Last but not least, we got a couple minutes left. Who all here is gonna be at KubeCon? I know obviously Yang, Surya, Dan, myself, Nadia, Hunter or Brian, are either of y'all gonna be there?
Going to contributor summit, but not the full conference.
Okay, cool.
Could only get out for a day.
Yeah, I won't be there.
Okay, no worries. You won't be there this year, but hopefully next year. So I'm thinking maybe at Contributor Summit, we all either meet up for, well, I think everyone in that group I just described is going to be there at Contributor Summit. So we should all meet up and either have breakfast at the Contributor Summit or lunch. I'm pretty impartial on both. We can keep it flexible, but we should all sit at the same table and kind of talk about our stuff, if that works for y'all.
Sounds good.
Are there any preferences on lunch or breakfast?
I would probably say lunch, because I'm flying to the East Coast, and 9 a.m. is usually 7 a.m. for me, so I can't promise breakfast.
Yeah, I'm probably the same. I'm going to the Blackhawks game the night before.
Oh, that's
And
exciting.
At breakfast, when everybody's first showing up, like everyone's going to be saying hi to everyone else and stuff like that. So Like,
Cool. So we'll plan on meeting up for lunch at the event. I'll try and make sure we have a table. It probably won't be like a dedicated, like it'll be, I'll just snag a table and we'll make it happen. So we can communicate with Slack on the day of. If anyone can't find us, we can all meet up. Cool. That's super exciting. Excited to see all of you. Hopefully the folks who aren't going to be able to make it this time will be there next time. That's kind of our goal. Hunter, as we also continue this, after you get this next PR merged, we probably need to go down the path of getting you added as a Kubernetes contributor. It'll just make our life easier. So if you could ping me on that over the next couple of weeks, that'd be great.
For next time, Hunter, I believe Contributor Summit attendance qualifies for Linux Foundation funding for travel. You can
Oh,
always
that's
apply.
awesome.
I didn't for this one, but realized it afterwards.
Yeah, and
Nice,
Yang
nice.
actually was able to get funding, some funding through, was it actually the CNCF or was it KubeCon?
I think CNCF, yeah, because there's I would say a lot of turbulences in my company recently, so they weren't sort of like funded for the full travel. So I was actually able to get funding from CNCF as a speaker, and I think for at least for a speaker and actual contributors, they have a pretty good chance of approval for travel if you everything like reasonable. So
yeah, I just got approved to speak at Cube Day Singapore. They didn't fund the whole thing, but they still funded some of it.
That'll be fun.
But that was Linux Foundation, not CNCF. So I'm not sure why it's one or the other sometimes.
Yeah, I can't keep track of all the foundations, to be honest with you, but
Yeah.
But that sounds really fun. So when is Singapore KubeCon?
December 12th, I think.
Wow, it's really nice. It's a pretty good time to go to, you know, a tropical destination as well.
Yeah, it's like pretty expensive though. So I'm basically flying in, speaking, and like flying out the next day. Could be exhausting.
Okay. Well, so our next meeting will be during KubeCon, so I'll probably go ahead, I think, or no, we have, this is, or no, yeah, it's every 2 weeks. So next meeting will be during KubeCon, so we will be canceling that meeting. I'll throw that note on the agenda. So I will see you all in about a month after KubeCon, and we can kind of follow up the next items. Thanks so much for all the help here. I feel like we're moving ahead pretty solidly, so keep it going. Hopefully we'll have a bunch of new faces after KubeCon. Have a good week, everybody. Talk to you later.
Thanks, guys. Bye.